and we're going to start looking at ecology, kind of segueing from the study of cells by means of the concept of serial endosymbiosis. This is one of the big biological ideas first proposed in its modern form in the 1970s. That's the idea that both mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, if you want to call them that, and chloroplasts, the organelles in plants and algae that carry out photosynthesis, were once originally free living bacteria that could live on their own. They entered into eukaryotic cells and they took up residence there, living inside them, and have become dependent on their eukaryote hosts and also indispensable to them. You can't live without mitochondria, and your mitochondria cannot live without you. But there's still evidence that they used to be independent. They have circular DNA like bacteria. They have smaller ribosomes like bacteria. They're wrapped in a double membrane like a bacterium would if it had been phagocytosed, taken inside a host eukaryote. And if you lose your mitochondria, say by being treated with certain drugs that will kill them, a cell can't get any more. And it turns out that that theme of symbiosis, tight relationships between two or sometimes more distantly related species, is very, 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 very common in the natural world. Quick example, on the right, that's a brain coral, a tropical coral, one of the ones that make reefs. On the left is a microscope picture of some of that coral's tissue, and the living part of the coral is green because it's absolutely packed full of little single-celled photosynthetic protists called dinoflagellates. Every one of those little green spots that you see is a little single-celled protist. It's not technically part of the coral tissue itself, and yet the coral can't live without them. Reef building corals don't grow if they don't get single-celled algae living inside them, carrying out photosynthesis. The coral gives them protection, and the algae provide the coral with food. That's a symbiosis. And coral reefs, most of them, certainly the tropical coral reefs, absolutely depend on this. They would not exist if it weren't for coral symbiosis. In fact, there are single-cell protists today that depend on symbiotic bacteria. This is a little thing called Pollinella, kind of a blobby cell, but it lives inside a skeleton of little plates that you can kind of see. And on the inside, you've got this kind of bluish green object shaped like a little curl. That's a photosynthetic bacterium, and it lives inside this single-celled eukaryote, Pollinella, which can't live without photosynthetic bacteria living inside it. That may give us some insight into what some of the earliest eukaryotes were like. Pollinella is not an ancestral eukaryote because those would have lived about 2 billion years ago. But it can give us some insight into how the earliest eukaryotes lived and what they may have looked like. And there's lots of examples of bacteria living inside single-celled protists. It happens all the time. And symbiosis is extremely common in ecology, the study of how organisms relate to each other and are affected by the environments that they live in. And here's an example you can see this time of year. That's a honeybee that's been at a flower feeding on nectar, that sweet liquid that flowers create, and also feeding on pollen. Honeybee will, of course, take a lot of the pollen and nectar back to the hive and store it as a food supply for the hive during the winter. But as honeybees are taking nectar and pollen, they get some pollen on themselves. This one is just covered with it, these little yellow grains. And the honeybees transfer pollen from one flower to another. Pollen grains contain the plant's sperm cells, and plants would not produce fruits and seeds if it were not for the honeybees that transfer pollen from one flower to a different flower. That's called pollination. And it's a type of symbiosis called mutualism, which means that both partners benefit. The bees get food, the flowers get the opportunity to reproduce. So both partners will benefit from this relationship. Bees are not the only pollinators. This is a tropical fruit bat chowing down on a nice tasty flower, and you can see the bat's face is completely covered in pollen. And when the bat goes on to another flower, the bat may eat some of it, but he will pollinate the flower. The flower will be able to produce fruits and seeds. Bats pollinate mangoes and guavas, vanilla orchids in the tropics. They also pollinate agave, without which we would have no tequila. Agave, blue agave in Mexico is a plant that yields a sweet sap that is fermented and distilled into tequila. So the margarita would not be possible without pollinator bats. Hummingbirds, butterflies, moths, even ordinary flies act as pollinators for different groups of flowering plants. And that's a mutualism again. The pollinators benefit because they get food. The plants benefit because they get to reproduce. Incidentally, the reason some of you are sneezing is that not all plants have pollinators. Oaks, for example, produce ridiculous amounts of pollen and then just let it all blow on the wind, which is why your car is probably covered in yellow dust right about now. Certainly ours get that way. Another example you can see on campus, these are lichens, these kind of crusty, sometimes powdery looking and sometimes leafy looking growths that you can commonly see on trees around here, old stone walls, not recent construction because it takes a long time for them to grow, but old gravestones may have lots of lichens. The stone walls around the Hendrix campus have lots of them. And I haven't mentioned them before because they're not actually plants. They might look sort of plant-like, but they're actually a combination of fungi, at least two species of fungi we now know, growing together with a photosynthetic protist, a single-celled alga. The protists do photosynthesis and provide nutrients to the fungi. The fungi grow in such a way as to give the protist protection. You can grow the fungi and the protist independently, but neither one looks like this. The only way you get this kind of crusty or, sometimes, stem-like growth shape is when both of them grow together and each one gets something from the other. I hope you'll take a liking to this. Right. Oh, one more. This is a plant root that's been stained with methylene blue, which you might remember from an earlier lab. And you can see these box-shaped things right there. That's just cell walls. Remember that plants have walls made out of cellulose. So there's a couple of cell walls that I've outlined. Inside the cells, you can see these little sphere-shaped things connected to filaments like that. Those are fungi. Those are fungi that are growing inside and all around the root cells of the plant. A number of fungi do cause plant disease. There's all sorts of nasty things that can befall your plants if fungi start attacking them. Everything from wood rot uh, to that awful white powdery stuff that usually murders the squash plants in my garden in summer. But there are some fungi that plants depend on. They're called mycorrhizae. Myco means a fungus. Rhiza is Greek for a root. These are root fungi. And they surround the plant roots when they're in the soil and grow into the roots and actually penetrate the root cells. What they do is they get nutrition from the plant roots. They get some of the sugars that the plant has made through photosynthesis, but the fungi can also extract minerals from the soil and pass those to the plant, minerals that the plant needs for growth. And 95% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizae. I'm not endorsing this particular brand. There's apparently a brand of mycorrhizae out called Great White. You can actually buy mycorrhizal spores, and you usually don't need to add them to your garden soil, but you can add them to your potted plants, and they'll do a lot better because ordinary potting soil may not contain mycorrhizae. And you can see without mycorrhizae, these marigolds are not doing nearly as well. Um, and yeah, most plant species will not grow very well unless mycorrhizae are present, even if you do add plenty of water and fertilizer. They still don't do well if they can't set up that mutualistic symbiosis. See, you're not only getting a great education in biology, you're getting gardening tips as well. This is like two courses for the price of one because UCA is all about value, right? Right. Okay, moving right along. A second type of symbiosis is parasitism. This is one of my favorites. You're looking, of course, at ears of corn. And these ears of corn have these awful gray growths on them that are feeding on and destroying the corn kernels. This is a fungus called Ustalagomydes. In Mexico, these are known as huitlacoche. And this is a case of parasitism because the fungus is benefiting, the corn is being harmed. The corn seeds are getting devoured by the fungus. And so this corn plant is not going to be able to reproduce very effectively um, because its seeds are getting digested in very slowly by the growth of this fungus. So that's a case of parasitism. One partner benefits, other partners harmed. Incidentally, you're not going to get this at your average local Mexican restaurant, but if you ever find a really authentic place, ask them if they've got huitlacoche because these things taste really good. Now they look gross, but they have this very nice mushroom-like taste, and people put them in tacos and in quesadillas and things like that. In really good grocery stores that cater to a Mexican clientele, you can get these canned. They're deliberately grown and they're quite tasty. So yeah, if you're looking for la comida más auténtica, go track down some huitlacoches. I promise you, they're delicious. So they're beneficial to us, or at least those of us that like Mexican cuisine, but they're parasites on the corn. Brace yourself for the next slide. These are some human parasites. That's somebody's intestines in the foreground. And the stuff in the background that looks like spaghetti is a roundworm in the genus Ascaris. This is the human intestinal roundworm. Not only do they live in your intestine and take nutrition right from the food that you're trying to digest, There, if you get too many of them, they can completely block your intestine, which is an immediate medical emergency. This is not usually much of a problem in the United States, but there are countries worldwide where Ascaris is a serious public health problem. And there's no shortage of other parasites that can infect humans and cause disease, suffering, and in some cases, even death. So that's the second type of symbiosis, parasitism. One partner benefits, the other partner is harmed. The third possibility is commensalism. One partner benefits, the other is neither really helped nor seriously harmed. So this is a cow. Any questions? And surrounding it, you have these little white birds, cattle egrets. I think those are native to India, but we have them here. They got introduced to North America many years ago. And cattle egrets like to hang out in cow pastures and follow cows around because as the cows graze, they stir up insects, and then the cattle egrets eat the insects. So the cattle egrets benefit by staying close to cows. As far as I know, the cows are not particularly benefited, but they're also not really harmed either. Here's a human example. This is a Demodex folliculorum. Its closest relatives that you might know would be ticks. And it lives in the follicles of human eyebrows and eyelashes. Now, there's actually a related species that causes a rather severe skin disease in dogs, called, it's one of the types of mange. If you know mange, that's a dog or cat skin disease. In us, though, we have Demodex living in our eyebrow and eyelash follicles. Most people have them. And normally, Demodex does not cause us any harm at all. It just feeds on dead skin cells. It feeds on sebum. That's skin oil, the oily secretion that your follicles make. And normally, it does no harm. If you have too many of them, if they get out of control, they can cause a skin condition called rosacea, which looks kind of like a reddening bumpiness of the skin. So they occasionally can cause minor problems, but most people never know if they have them. Many of you probably have these in your eyebrows and eyelashes, and normally they're not going to do you any harm. So that's yet another case of commensalism. Demodex benefits from living on you. You are neither benefited nor harmed. You probably never even knew that they were there. And some of you might have been happier not knowing that they were there, but they are. But that's commensalism for you. So that's my segue to ecology, the study of how organisms interact with each other and interact with their surroundings. And we're finally back to a part of the course that I can demonstrate by, telling you to go look at things, on your front lawn. And we can study ecology at different levels of organization. If we want to look at the set of all members of a single species in a single area, that's a population. So we could talk about the human population of Conway, or the clover population on the grassy lawn in front of the new Conway Corp Center for Sciences building. We could talk about the crappie population in Lake Conway or anything like that. If you look at interacting populations of several species in one area, you have a community. So we could be talking about the fish community of Lake Conway would include the crappie and the bluegills and the gizzard shad and the shiners. Well, they may not have shiners in there, but all of the species of fish living in Lake Conway. We could talk about the plant community of the nature reserve, and that would include the greenbrier and the possum haw and the eastern spider lilies and the wild blackberries and the sweet gum trees, dot, 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 all of those. If you look at an area's, all of its communities together with their non-living surroundings, things that aren't alive but are important, like light and temperature and water, we talk about an ecosystem. So you could talk about the ecosystem of the nature reserve or the ecosystem of um, the Ozark forests or the ecosystem of Lake Conway. That's all the communities taken into consideration with their non-living surroundings. A set of similar ecosystems is called a biome. So we can talk about the rainforest is a good example. We could talk about the rainforest biomes. There's tropical rainforests in Brazil and in parts of Africa and in northern Australia and New Guinea, but they're all different types of rainforests, so we could group them as a biome. We could talk about the grassland biome of the western United States and northern Argentina, the Pampas. We could talk about the desert biomes of the western United States and Namibia and central Australia and the Sahara Desert of northern Africa. Those all have somewhat different communities, but there's things that are similar about them. So we could group all of those as a biome. And then ultimately, all life on Earth can be called the biosphere, the sum total of everything that's living, at least on this planet. If Mars turns out to have life on it, it will have a separate biosphere. So let's start by just looking at populations. Let's say we're looking at the population of crappies in Lake Conway. For those that don't know, crappies are a tasty fish that's rather fun to catch. My cross the street neighbor goes out catching crappies in Lake Conway, or trying to. I've never actually seen him catch one, but he's got a boat, so he tries. Anyway, if there were absolutely no controls, the population of anything, crappies in Lake Conway, fruit flies in your kitchen, anything like that, would grow exponentially, which is another way of saying that it would double over a set period of time. Let's say it would double in a week and then double again in another week and double again in yet another week. So going from a starting population to 2 times that, 4 times that, 8 times that, 16 times that, and a curve showing exponential growth over time looks like this. This is an exponential curve, or as it's sometimes called, a J curve, because it looks kind of like a J. And it would keep increasing upwards and upwards without limit. You will not have to solve this equation on the exam, but I just want you to look at what that equation looks like. The population at a given time, which we call n subscript t, is equal to the starting population times an irrational number called e, that's 2.71828 dot dot dot, e to the power of the length of time the population's been growing, multiplied by r, the intrinsic rate of increase. That's a number that's just expressing how steep that curve is. If R is 0, then e to the RT is equal to 1, and the population at any time is equal to the starting population, meaning the population's not growing. If that R is any larger than 0, then that population is going to increase, and it's going to increase in such a way that it doubles after some set interval of time. Ta-da! Now, how fast does this work out to be? I think I mentioned we use fruit flies as model organisms in genetics. The life cycle of common fruit flies takes about 7 days under ideal conditions. If you have a pair of flies and you keep them at perfect temperature, give them all the rotten bananas they can possibly feed on, give them all the water they need, keep predators away from them, just put them in like Club Med for freaking fruit flies, and you let them reproduce as much as they're capable of, then you go from adults to adults in about 7 days. So if you started with one pair of flies in perfect, Club Med conditions with everything they needed, and you let them breed as much as they could, and you let their offspring breed as much as they could, in a year you would have a ball of flies the size of the Earth. Now, the fact that the Earth has not been completely replaced with a ball of flies suggests that something has to be happening to keep populations down. And this was one of Darwin's insights, if you remember, that in theory, populations can increase exponentially without limit. But in the real world, populations tend to stay constant, and it's not physically possible for any of them to increase indefinitely. Something somewhere has to ensure that not all fruit flies that are born survive to reproduce themselves. Now, that could be starvation, lack of food, lack of water. It could be, inability to find a mate. Maybe some fruit flies really do prefer living in the basement playing Roblox or Fortnite or whatever it is. It could be predators, spiders and things like that. It could be diseases and parasites. Fruit flies do get those. It could be lots of things, but all of these factors are going to tend to act to keep the population down. And all of those factors together determine an ecosystem's carrying capacity for a population. That's the maximum number of individuals in a population that a given ecosystem can stably support. And that's determined by biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic is things that are living. So biotic factors that limit the number of fruit flies in your kitchen would be the amount of food for them, the amount of bananas that you forgot about and left out on the counter, the presence of predators, the presence of parasites, the presence of angry roommates with fly swatters. All of those are biotic. Abiotic factors are things that aren't alive, and they might include the amount of light, the temperature. Fruit flies reproduce more slowly when it's cold, level of moisture, the amount of oxygen that's present. If you're a plant, it might be the availability of nutrients in the soil, things like that. And all of those together determine carrying capacity. And in a simple model, what a real world population will do is grow exponentially for a time and then start leveling off. That doesn't mean the population stops reproducing. If you have fruit flies in your kitchen, they will continue to reproduce as long as they can. But where the curve levels off is the point where births in the population get balanced by deaths. So the fruit flies are still mating and laying eggs when they're up here, It's just that the new fruit flies that are being born are balancing the number of fruit flies that are dying from old age, disease, predators, parasites, whatever it is. And so the population doesn't grow any farther. This is called logistic growth, and this type of growth curve is called a sigmoid. Sigmoid means shaped like the Greek letter sigma, or in this case, the letter S. And you can see that this is kind of shaped like a letter S. If you turn it 45 degrees, it's shaped like the old Studebaker car logo, which looked like this. So anyway, that's why it's called a sigmoid curve. Sigmoid means S-shaped. So what'll sometimes happen is that a population will grow exponentially for a time and then level off as it reaches carrying capacity. By the way, carrying capacity is spelled with a K, not because the guy who made this diagram was illiterate, but because in the math that we use to describe the growth of a population, carrying capacity is abbreviated with a capital K. So a population might rise to the carrying capacity and then plateau, or a population might boom and exceed carrying capacity temporarily, but it will always fall back down. It will go through a boom where it exceeds carrying, and then once it's above carrying, the deaths begin to outweigh the births, and the population falls back under the carrying capacity. So when species vastly overshoot K, you can get population explosions. That's a locust swarm in 2013 that ate everybody's crops on the island of Madagascar. That's just a case where the locust population conditions were just right for it to expand immensely and temporarily overshoot carrying capacity, eat everything, and then everybody starved to death, and that was the end of it. That's a case where a species overshoots K and then crashes back down. Okay, last concept. If you have several populations in an area, they can influence each other in ways that are more subtle. This is some data from northern Canada, from the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company used to buy, I think they may still buy, animal furs from trappers. And they've kept records of the furs that they buy, and the records go back over 150 years. And there's two species of importance in northern Canada. On the left, that's a Canadian lynx, closely related to the bobcats that we have down here. On the right, that's a snowshoe hare, which happens to be the lynx's favorite food. Now, because the Hudson Bay keeps records of the furs, that's essentially that they buy every year. That is what we call a proxy for population size, meaning that in years where there's lots of lynx, the trappers bring in lots of lynx furs, and in years when there's not many lynx, the trappers don't bring in many lynx furs. So the data that the Hudson Bay Company has on the furs that it buys stand in for data on the population size of lynxes and hares. And it turns out that that data looks like this, that the populations follow regular cycles of boom and bust, and a cycle that's roughly 9-10 years in length from one peak to another peak. And what I want you to see is that the lynx population usually peaks just a little bit after the hare population peaks. So like right here, that's the point where the snowshoe hare population peaked. And notice right here, just a couple of years later, is where the lynx population peaked. And right there, that's the same. That's where the hare population peaks. Right there, just 1 or 2 years after is when the lynx population was at its peak. Same thing here with a bit more delay. There's the peak snowshoe hares. There's the peak lynx population maybe 3 years later. Go back here. There's the peak hare population. And right there is the peak, come on, Wagner, the peak lynx population just a couple of years after. Now, why is this? The reason is that the hares are the main food supply that the lynx depend on. So here you've got a Canadian lynx that's about to kill and devour a helpless little snowshoe hare. And so if we start this, imagine the hares are increasing in numbers, right? The hares are breeding like rabbits, and making lots of babies. And as the hare population goes up, there's more food for the lynxes. When there's more food for the lynxes, then mommy lynx can take care of more kittens, and the lynx population becomes greater. But when the lynx population is large, the lynxes become so common that they eat many more hares. Like this lynx that is about to eat a helpless little bunny wabbit. Killed a wabbit, killed a wabbit. And when the wabbit gets killed, the hare population falls. So the lynxes eat so many hares that the hare population drops. Suddenly, this means there's less food for the lynxes, and the lynxes become less abundant. Mommy lynx can't raise as many kittens to adulthood successfully. Some of the lynxes may starve. The lynxes become less abundant. But then when the lynxes are less abundant, now the hares begin increasing in number because there's few lynxes to kill them, so they can have more babies. And so you end up with these regular cycles of population size in both the hares and in the lynxes, with the lynxes just a little bit behind the hares, maybe 1, 2, or 3 years behind the hares. So these two populations influence each other to go into this regular 9 to 10 year cycle of booms and bust, with one of them just a little bit behind the other. And I would like to say I really like this picture. All right, that would be 10:50. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there. That's a good place to stop.